Hi, I'm Erica Gallatin of Sovereignty Herbs, and I'm out today with my girl Mello out in the woods to check on how the ramps are doing in our ramp holler and maybe harvest a few. And I thought this would be a really great opportunity to speak to you all about wild garlic as a species, but also about the concept of sustainable harvesting and what that might look like for ramps in particular. And, I talked about ramps a little bit in a previous video, but I thought it was an important, it's important species to kind of hone in on, especially as a wild food, as a wild edible that is in really, really high demand right now. So one of the first things that I want to mention is that, I think that there's this kind of misconception that abundance is context dependent, and it really, really isn't. What I mean by that is that, within this context that I'm standing in, ramps look abundant. They're absolutely everywhere. You can see them all kind of covering up. All this huge drain behind me is just covered in ramps. And without knowing any better or thinking about the species at large and its survivability, I would be looking at this situation like, oh, wild ramps, of course, you can harvest as much as you want because there's tons of them everywhere. But when I kind of zoom out to look at the bigger picture, I'm in a 3,000 acre parcel right now, okay? And so how many places within that 3,000 acres are gonna look like this? That's just a question. Not many, not many. And so in order to, sustainably interact with this species as a wild food, we have to start thinking differently about what abundance might mean. I also think that it's really, really interesting, and a point that I just want to note when it comes to, kind of wild harvesting for foods or medicinals. It's really fascinating to me how the plant kingdom can hold up, such a brilliant reflection of human gluttony. When we're faced with a situation like this one behind me, it's like, oh my gosh, ramps, 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 let's dig, let's dig, let's dig, let's dig. And we could say the same for a bunch of other really high commodity forest plants as well. And what is that? What does that need to take and have more and more and more and more, and to the point where there's nothing left for the wild world? What is that about us? I think it's wonderful. Probably one of the reasons why I love the plant kingdom so much. They do ask us to really look at ourselves. So anyway, without much ado, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my ramp harvesting process and what that means. And just err on the side of caution that you want to make sure you're properly identifying species before you harvest them and consume them in any way. So this is something that takes time and practice. So first things first, when talking about sustainable harvesting, I think it's important to note that this particular ecosystem where we are right now is rather precious in regards to the fact that it's generally been undisturbed for quite some time. And because of this, there's an opportunity for all kinds of wonderful woodland plants to come back and to thrive here. For example, the cohoshes or the thalictrums that are actually currently in bloom, and the trilliums, and all of these really wonderful species that we love so much. And so when we're going into this kind of ecosystem, we want to make sure that we do so in a light-footed fashion, that we're not just trampling around right to the middle of the ramp patch and crushing everything in our path. I always suggest, starting on the edges of a particular population and being very mindful of where you step. Also, if you go out when it's really, really wet, you're going to do more damage to the soil and to the plants that are, living in it and trying to wake up. So just keep in mind that sustainable harvesting also includes being mindful of the ecosystem at large and not trampling through it and making a huge mess. So another thing that I think is important to note about sustainable harvesting is that it's always a good idea to have a plan, right? So when you get out into a wild space in the collection of wild plants, that you're not just, you don't have a goal in mind, that, you know, you just harvest and harvest and harvest and harvest. Because I think that can be wasteful, especially if you're not prepared to deal with processing that plant material properly. You know, and you don't want to waste anything that you've harvested. So, you know, I think it's always a good idea to go out into a wild space for wild harvesting with a plan. And that, you know, maybe this situation, it could be a ramp pesto batch, or, you know, even making a tincture from the leaves, which I like to do as an herbalist. It's a great way to support the immune system. So, you know, I think that don't just go out to harvest without thinking first about how much you should take, how much you're planning on taking. Go out with a goal. I think that's probably a really good plan. And maybe take your dog, because they may really enjoy the woods. So when we're looking at the kind of growth habit or morphology of the plant, you can really get in close and see that we have two leaves, two large ramp leaves, coming out of a single stalk. Let's zoom in there and get a little bit closer. There we go. And this is connected to a single bulb under the ground, like most of its relatives in the Allium genus. It has a bulb and a single shoot that then unfolds these beautiful leaves. So traditionally speaking, people have harvested the bulbs of ramps as well as the leaves. So they would go in and they would pull out the bulb, dig out the bulb, and take the whole plant with them. But, you know, it's important to note that when you take the bulb, you take the whole plant, you kill the plant, you deprive that particular individual of being able to flower and then reproduce. So, and here we have, these are kind of the leftover flowers from the ramps there, which set seed, and then that's how the species spreads, is through its seed. So if you take these out, you dig all this out, this no longer has the ability to flower and set seed to reproduce itself, right? So you take the root, you kill the plant, kind of thing. So the other thing that I want to show you that's really important here is this, you know, how there are two leaves. There are two leaves here. So, you know, I discourage taking the bulb. You don't want to take the bulb. The leaves will be just fine. And, you know, you focus on simply one leaf at a time from each plant. I don't want to take both leaves from these, even though they're nice and juicy and beautiful looking. I just want to, you know, remember that this plant needs to survive, and that if I take both of these, it won't be able to photosynthesize. Okay, so again, we're harming the strength and fortitude of the individual. So to minimize our impact, it's always suggested that you take just one leaf per plant from plants that only have two leaves. Don't take from plants that only have one leaf, because again, you don't want to deprive that particular individual from photosynthesizing and being able to reproduce. And it's really, really easy. You know, you can use pruners, but I just tend to use my hands. You just kind of come to the base here and you can just pinch it off very easily with your hand. So one last thing that I want to note about, and I mean, there's lots of things that I could say about sustainable harvesting, but to keep this short and sweet, you know, the other thing that I want to mention when it comes to ramps specifically is that when you look and you see there's this whole huge area of ramps that I'm not going to trample through. I want to make sure that I do move around a little bit, right? So I'm not just, you know, pulling one leaf off of all the plants in one area. You want to move around gingerly as much as possible. And I was always taught to, harvest in a way that you couldn't tell that you were there. So if you start to notice as you go back around and you're, taking leaves off the plants that you can see where you've already been, you might be taking too much from that particular area. So just something to keep in mind. Right, Mello? Yeah. I think she's getting bored.